The Six-Day War, third of 5 Arab-Israeli wars. A conflict whose outcome was made inevitable by air power on the first day. A war fought on 3 fronts, each quite different. The Sinai Desert, scene of dramatic tank battles and the destruction of an entire army. The largely urban street battles in Jordan as the Israelis fought their way into the holy city of Jerusalem. And the mountainous Golan Heights, torn from Syrian control by bulldozers, tanks and infantry. Israel was created by the United Nations partition of Palestine in 1947, giving 45% to the Arabs and 55% to the new Jewish state. The Israelis gained further territory when hostile Arab reaction led to war. All 5 Arab nations declared war in an attempt to stifle Israel at birth. Israelis struggled for their state's very existence, creating a defense force characterized by officer-led units and reliance on flexibility, surprise and innovation. The 1949 armistice established new borders, largely where the opposing armies' front line stood at the end of hostilities. But the conflict also created huge numbers of Palestinian refugees. 350,000 fled to Jordan, mostly to the West Bank area. Unlike Jewish refugees, the Palestinians were not absorbed by their new host countries. Instead, they were left in camps where they became a focus for Arab discontent. With no lasting peace, a revolution in Egypt bringing Gamal Abd al-Nasser to power made another war increasingly likely. Assuming command of the combined armies of Egypt, Jordan and Syria, his avowed intention was the destruction of Israel, but the Israelis resolved to strike first. An Egyptian blockade of Tehran prompted the Israeli offensive, which opened with a paratroop drop near the strategic Mitla Pass, backed by armoured assaults. The campaign then gradually built up momentum with attacks to isolate the bulk of the Egyptian army in the north and to end the blockade that had been denying Israeli access to the sea. The Israeli plan was designed to keep the Egyptians guessing whether it was an all-out offensive or just another reprisal raid. Both sides used weapons mainly of Second World War vintage in battles that demonstrated the lasting importance of tanks. Israel's victory proved she had built an effective army on the experiences of the 1948 War of Independence, an army marked by a positive ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. And the architect of that victory, General Moshe Dayan, would go on to repeat it more spectacularly in 1967. Egyptian strategy was flawed. It kept strong forces close to the Israeli border, but most of them on the wrong side of the Suez Canal. They therefore celebrated a victory, maintaining that they'd been forced to withdraw under threat from British and French forces. They had parachuted in to secure the Suez Canal, recently nationalized by Nasser. Scuttled ships remained as a sign that little had been achieved to bring peace to the region. Israeli settlements were attacked, some shelled, others were the target of guerrilla raids by Palestinian Fedayeen. The tempo of tit-for-tat border raids and reprisals grew as the Israelis dug in to protect themselves. They responded by mounting cross-border raids, first against villages sheltering terrorists, then against regular military bases. This was Jenin in Jordan. Over a decade, 1,000 Israelis died, but little is known about Arab casualties. In 1964, an Arab scheme to divert the waters of the River Jordan away from Israel heightened tension further, bringing the Israelis to the brink of war. The biggest Israeli reprisal raid brought armor and air power onto the village of Al-Samu in Jordan. It was also the first Israeli raid mounted in daylight. Al-Samu had been a forward base for Fedayeen from Syria, mounting raids on Israeli settlements in the northern Negev near the Dead Sea. In April 1967, a major dogfight developed between Syria's Russian MiGs and Israel's French-built Mystères as the Israelis struck at Syrian artillery that had been shelling settlements. In a foretaste of the war soon to follow, 6 Syrian MiGs were lost. Alarmed, the Syrians sought Egyptian help. They responded by demanding withdrawal of the United Nations troops who'd been guarding Israel's southern border by occupying Sinai since the 1956 war. In mid-May, the United Nations Secretary-General U Thant unilaterally agreed to this demand, and the crisis deepened. 3 days later, 7 Egyptian divisions with over 100,000 men and 1,000 tanks had massed along Israel's southwestern border. Huge armoured convoys were on the move too in Jordan. Jordan's leader, King Hussein, was more worried about seeming to be the odd man out in the Arab alliance than by the possibility of war. Within a week, Arab armies had massed at all Israeli borders, creating a crisis from which they hoped to gain political advantage. But as Arab war hysteria mounted, Egypt was unable to control that crisis and effectively backed Israel into a corner. The thousands who poured onto the streets were forcing action against the state they wanted to destroy for 2 decades. Israelis mobilized against what they saw as a clear threat. But time was vital. The Israelis couldn't keep their citizen army in uniform for much more than 2 weeks without endangering their economy. They also lacked the geographical depth to fight a defensive battle and then mount a successful counterattack. Defense through offensive action was their only option. To run that offensive, the Israelis brought in General Moshe Dayan as Minister of Defense. An underground fighter during the War of Liberation, he had proved a daring battalion commander who established the ruthless fighting spirit that typified Israeli operations. A brilliant strategist, he was the architect of a stunning victory. The Egyptian leader, Gamal Abd al-Nasser, was the driving force who brought on the war, but he consistently underestimated Israeli strength and commitment while exaggerating Egypt's strength in a manner that proved fatal as he failed to foresee the tactics that would be employed against him. Jordan's King Hussein was Egypt's reluctant ally, afraid of being the odd man out among the Arab nations. He led the most effective Arab army, but was deceived by his allies, losing half his kingdom as he was abandoned by Iraq and Syria. Hafez al-Assad was the Syrian defense minister who saw his air force destroyed on the ground as he delayed opening a third front. His failure to help Jordan was bitterly resented by King Hussein. As the Arab nations moved their armies onto Israel's borders, Israel resolved to mount a preemptive blitzkrieg. It was spearheaded by the Air Force, which in the first few hours won complete air superiority by destroying the Arab air forces on the ground. The Israelis scrambled at breakfast time. In the first wave, French-built Mystère fighter bombers. Air Force commanders had correctly assumed that the Egyptians would be unprepared, with most officers still driving to their bases. Peeling off to fly in low under Arab radar, the strike planes knocked out the Egyptian Air Force largely before it could leave the ground. Air crews flew some 500 sorties before mid-morning. At each briefing, pilots were told their first priority was to destroy planes on the ground, spending as long as possible over the target and returning on minimum fuel. Mirage 3s speed to their distant targets, flying low over the Mediterranean to evade Egyptian radar. Some Egyptian MiGs escaped the onslaught. Altogether, 19 Egyptian air bases were put out of action and over 400 planes destroyed as the Israeli jets arrived simultaneously over their targets. Those Egyptian planes that did get airborne were destroyed in dogfights. The Israelis lost 26 aircraft, but won air supremacy, which proved decisive in the fighting to come. This remarkable achievement was summed up by its architect, the daring and innovative Israeli Air Commander, Major General Mordecai Hod.
The Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, or almost destroyed, in 3 hours. As a matter of fact, a little bit less than 3 hours, but I'll make it around the figure. The achievement, of course, was made by pilots, very young ones. The average age of the Israeli pilots is about 23. They are all trained here by the Israeli Air Force. And now I can say they are the best pilots in the world.
With command of the skies, Israeli armor mounted a complex series of lightning strikes, notably on Abu Agela and other key Egyptian fortified towns in northern Sinai and Gaza. A series of battles took them west to Bir Gafgafka and south to break the blockade of Tehran and complete the encirclement of the Egyptian divisions at Nakle. Monday, June the 5th, 1967, and the Israelis prepare to launch their singularly devastating offensive across the Egyptian border. Here, in the desert wastes, 3 Israeli divisions had gathered to face 7 Egyptian divisions, a force nearly 3 times larger and with at least double the number of tanks. The assault was spearheaded by the British Centurion tank, which decisively outscored the Russian-built T-54-55s used by the Egyptians. Alongside them, jeeps with anti-tank recoilless rifles. The speed of the advance surprised the Egyptians, who expected the slower tempo of opening moves seen in 1956. But instead of striking at the center, the Israelis attacked Gaza. The breakthrough was achieved by the 7th Armored Brigade, commanded by Colonel Shmuel Gonen. They outflanked the fortifications and minefields, attacking over dunes considered impassable by the Egyptian defenders. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting followed the tank battle, and the main towns fell before dusk on the first day. Egyptian tanks fell prey to well-armed and efficient infantry. Israeli tank commanders were also frequent casualties, a result of fighting from open turrets. Some trenches were only cleared after bitter exchanges. But it was accomplished with little loss of momentum to the offensive. The strategy continually was to trap and encircle enemy armor and destroy it as it tried to break out. The Israelis entered Gaza on Tuesday lunchtime, halfway through the second day after what they described as a brutal battle. But the pause, like the welcome, would be short-lived. Thousands of mines had to be cleared from the deep echelons of the Egyptian defensives. But as some rested momentarily, others fought street battles to flush out the last resistance by Egyptian commandos. It was a bitter and unexpected defeat for the Egyptians. The Egyptian commander in Gaza, Major General Abdul Munah Husseini, still looks bewildered by the speed of his force's demise as he signs the surrender document, hastily scribbled out on a scrap of paper by his Israeli captors. Further west, Wessex helicopters brought in paratroopers by night to outflank Egyptian strongpoints in the most important battle of the Sinai Theatre for Abu Agheila. Here, the Israeli offensive was led by a future defense minister, General Ariel Sharon. Once they reached the main Egyptian defensive positions, Sharon brought forward the divisional artillery units to soften them up by persistent bombardment. Abu Agheila fell at lunchtime on the second day after what was probably the most complicated battle of all the Arab-Israeli wars. By Wednesday, Egyptian forces were fleeing for safety beyond the Suez Canal. Israeli training aircraft, modified to take rockets, joined the attack on the disintegrating Egyptian armies. They swooped on the fleeing convoys as they converged on the bottleneck of the Mitla Pass, just 20 kilometers from the Suez Canal. Mirage 3s, recently brought from France, were also bombed up. Refueling, rearming and changing pilots took just 7 minutes before the next series of strikes that decimated the Egyptian army east of Suez. The 3 Israeli brigades were now being closely coordinated to prevent them mistakenly firing on each other. Seven Egyptian divisions, 70,000 men, were totally destroyed in scenes that became famous around the world. In many cases, vehicles and weapons were simply abandoned in the haste to get back to the Suez Canal. Hundreds of vehicles littered the landscape. With the dramatic collapse of the Egyptian army, the way was wide open to the Suez Canal. In front of them, fewer than 100 of the Egyptians' 1,000 tanks managed to cross the canal to safety. Their rout had been compounded by conflicting orders from the Egyptian commander, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Ammar, which created panic in the defeated army. The strategic rail bridge over the canal was reached on the 4th afternoon. But none of the troops who relaxed along the canal banks that Thursday would say that it had been easy.
I have seen it to be not very easy. They were fighting from house to house. You can see the shells in the houses here, that people had to fight from house to house. Most of it was done by the tanks, the light tanks.
Yes, he is one from the big fighters here.
How good was the Egyptian fighting yesterday?
Not very bad, but we are better.
In the east, the Israelis began by cutting off Jerusalem from the bulk of the Jordanian army in the north, which also found itself quickly under fire. Further offensives north of Jerusalem seized control of the Judean hills. Within 3 days, most major centers west of the Jordan were in Israeli hands, including the ancient cities of Jericho and Bethlehem. The Jerusalem Corridor was the key to control of the Judean hills and Jerusalem, for it overlooks all approaches to the Holy City itself. Its strategic importance had been recognized in ancient times by Joshua. The Harold Brigade was sent in to secure it after Jordan had opened hostilities with an artillery barrage. They advanced on the strategic Radar Hill in difficult mountainous terrain where well-fortified Arab Legion positions covered all approaches. A crucial tank battle was fought by night, the Israelis' old Sherman tanks using their searchlights to pick out targets regardless of the risk to their own columns. The brigade finally broke through the Jordanian lines to seize the mountain ridge and road connecting Jerusalem and Ramallah. And Israeli jets used their air supremacy to decimate fortified positions outside Jerusalem and any attempts to reinforce them. The battle for Nablus was typical of the Jordanian front. It was largely an urban affair, fought over the streets and buildings of cities and towns with deep religious connotations for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. Just as in Vietnam, half a world away, the medevac teams were helicoptered into battlefield situations to take out the wounded. Reservists taken prisoner while still in civilian dress were evidence of the speed of the Israeli assault. Nonetheless, the Jordanians, with the smallest of the Arab armies, proved to be the only ones to inflict damage on Israel as the conflict unfolded. Jerusalem's Wailing Wall was reached on the fourth day, the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan posting prayers of thanks. This was a deeply religious site denied them under the 1947 partition, but staying there would fuel Arab anger for years to come. The battles for control of what is now known as the West Bank flowed through buildings and fortified positions honeycombed with complex reinforced defences. Here was where they met the men of the Arab Legion's El Hashim and Hittin brigades, their most effective opponents. In the towns, troops found heavily defended buildings, some several stories high, all interconnected by deep trenches and protected by minefields. Here, too, the Israelis suffered half their fatal casualties of the entire war. Once again, it was the potent firepower of the Israeli Air Force that broke the threatened deadlock, as an emotional King Hussein acknowledged in defeat.
The battle was waged against us mainly from the air, almost exclusively from the air, with such overwhelming strength and continued sustained air attack on every single unit, on every single formation of our armed forces, day and night, right till last night.
Thereafter, Israeli troops swiftly occupied villages and towns of both religious and political importance to Muslims, Jews and Christians alike. Here, Jericho, whose walls had fallen without a fight, just as in biblical times. Jordan, a reluctant ally of the Egyptians, had, in population terms, lost half its kingdom. Bethlehem was among the last Jordanian towns to be occupied. Little resistance was encountered because, lacking reinforcements, the bulk of the Jordanian forces had been skillfully withdrawn. Also on the move, a trickle at first, the people whose plight would prove to be the one matter that prevented any attempt at a lasting peace, the Palestinians. Already, Arab propaganda was warning them that there would be no safe haven for them in the occupied territories. The desire to flee was further fueled by the fact that Jordan and other Arab countries paid them remittances. These would be unavailable if they remained in the West Bank. Few did remain to support the suggestion of a Palestinian homeland in the West Bank territory, and the opportunity to use their plight as a political weapon was not lost on the defeated Arab nations. The formidable natural obstacle of the Golan Heights dominated the northern offensive against Syria. Israel's strategy involved three main thrusts to take Quneitra. Two further offensives literally bulldozed their way to command the road to Damascus before a United Nations ceasefire line halted the advance. The Golan Heights dominate Israel from a plateau up to 1,200 meters above the Jordan Valley. With gun emplacements, deep trenches and dug-in tanks, the Syrians had converted the area into a deep defense zone. From here, sporadic artillery and gunfire was directed onto Israeli settlements. Briefing the officers who would lead the assault, the Israelis stressed how Syrian deployments obviously relied on the difficulties of the terrain to aid their defenses. Israeli armor moves north. Freed from fighting in Sinai after the Egyptian collapse, heavy brigades moved swiftly through Israel to face the Syrians. Moshe Dayan had hesitated about attacking Syria in case it drew in their Russian allies. Now the delay had worked in his favor. On the fifth day of the war, he moved on to the offensive, and Colonel Albert Mandler's entire armored brigade moved up along a single axis. To force their way into the mountains and through the complex Syrian defenses, they played an unexpected card. The assault was led by an engineer detachment with a company of bulldozers, which forced a way for the tanks up the rocky hillside. All of them were hit in the action, each losing several crews to concentrated artillery and machine gun fire before their job was done. Gradually, the brigade fought its way up the steep ascent to take the Syrian strongpoints in hand-to-hand fighting. Here, as in the British assault on the Falklands, Israeli forces were personally led into battle by their officers. From the rear, Israeli artillery shelled the most stubborn Syrian strongpoints with pinpoint accuracy. Syrian panic was heightened by Israeli airstrikes. It was a costly advance, but by the end of the first day, the Israelis had broken through at several key points. From then on, the Syrians abandoned their carefully constructed defenses and withdrew rapidly. Next day, the last of this war, the Israeli columns moved swiftly on to the strategic Syrian town of Quneitra. They entered it after a brief hour-and-a-half's firefight on the afternoon of the sixth day. the Syrian army had collapsed in less than 27 hours of bitter fighting. From here, the road to Damascus was wide open and the Syrian capital at their mercy. Only intervention by the United Nations halted the rout. It had cost the Israelis 115 dead. The Syrians lost about 1,000. Their outstanding victory gave the Israelis defense in depth for the first time in their history. Instead of being threatened by neighbors, Israeli forces now occupied the areas from which those threats were mounted. Now they pose the threat themselves. A matter for celebrations. But the celebrations obscured military shortcomings as they overlooked the fact that their achievements were due more to Arab negligence than their own superiority. As a result, the Arabs who now gave in learned more from their mistakes than the Israelis did. And that was something the Israelis would discover to their cost within 6 years in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Refusal to trade conquered lands for security guarantees fueled the refugee problem that would return to haunt Israel time and again, even until today. Hundreds of thousands of uprooted Palestinians were on the move, many the same people that had fled the Israeli War of Independence 20 years earlier. With Arab countries refusing to absorb them, many professed a desire to live in their homelands in peace.
They are happy to live anywhere in peace.
Yes, all right.
Everything that they need, peace, everywhere. Nothing except peace.
Israel's Moshe Dayan publicly tried to allay their fears, but privately, most Israelis feared sabotage campaigns if the refugees stayed.
I'm not doing anything to stop them by force. I don't think that anyone should stop anyone if he wants to leave the country. I'm trying to find out why they leave, and if they are scared or something like that, then to lift that, to ascertain them that there's no reason to leave. But if they do want to leave for a personal reason, then we do not stop them by force.
The refugees, however, continued to struggle over the Allenby Bridge into unoccupied Jordan. Whatever the promises, they believed Israeli occupation would be harsh, and their plight highlighted the problem of statelessness and increased the appetite for revenge that led to the Yom Kippur War of 1973.